take a look at some basically minor piece endgames, knight and pawn versus bishop and pawn endgames. And then I was thinking we could do basically our standard 3-game analysis. But I was actually really interested in looking at these games. I think they're pretty interesting. I just wanted to go through the main lines in these ones. This is an old Levenfish Ragozin game from 1939. But basically what kind of the main point of this is to demonstrate the value of white having this outside pass pawn. This outside pass pawn is sort of the dominant characteristic of this position. With c6, c7, c8, I think white should be in a pretty good place. So that's sort of what I would look at in this, and basically, this is black to play and white winning this game. And it's kind of interesting because the biggest mismatch between this, and it's way bigger than the difference between the relative values of the knights versus the bishop, is the pawn on the outside. So here, king to f8, knight to d2, king to e8, and this king's basically going to try to get behind this pawn. I'm just playing out the main line for now. We can stop or go to sidelines if anyone's interested. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, we can definitely take a look. Otherwise, I'm just going to be playing out the main lines from these from these games. This is always from Basic Chess Endgames, this very old book that I have by Fine. And I think overall it's a pretty strong it's a pretty strong game. Or a pretty strong book, and it's really helpful for me to actually go through these. It's the type of thing where you say that you're going to do it, and then you kind of put it off because it's a low priority thing. But actually having this stream and being able to set up the positions and go through them and think about them critically, it's super helpful for me. So. Anyways, here's this position. It's from this old Levenfish Ragozin game from Basic Chess Endgames, and white wins from the original position. The original position, by the way, is this, and it's black to move. Black moves king to f8, but it's basically black to move here, and it's a demonstration of how white can win with this outside pass pawn. So, c6, king d8, king e4. King c7, king d5, f5, and basically this is basically starting to try to get some of the play to be directed towards the king side. Black wants to try to create a pass pawn on the king side. If black can create a pass pawn on the king side and white is forced into a position where he doesn't have to defend the pawn on c6, that's going to be a much better situation for black. Basically here white's holding on to c6, and there's not really many challenges in terms of advancing these pawns on the king side. So this king's on d5 and f5 gets played. All right, g takes f5, g takes f5, king takes, knight to b3. But basically here, white's used this ability, used basically this outside pawn to move it forward, and then, this king is opposing on c6. But basically, white's going to end up with the ability to get into these pawns because he was able to use this basically c4, c5, c6 moves from the outside c pawn as a way of getting his white into black's position here. This white king is on e5, going to take f5. And going to try to take this pawn as well. So if white can get basically to the situation where white has a passed f pawn and a passed h pawn, and it's just it has the knight against the bishop, so basically white up 2 pawns in this endgame, I think that should be a win. But we'll see how this actually plays out in practice. Anyways, having that passed c6 pawn and pushing that forward allowed white to move his king forward and basically successfully take at least the f pawn, and I think also the h pawn is coming up. So that's an interesting strategy. We can take it again from the beginning, but I'll just play out the rest of this. Bishop d6, king e6, bishop to h2, knight d4, check, king c5, knight takes, h5, knight g3, king d4, king to f5, and definitely feel free to these lessons are really it's good if they're interactive. Definitely if you guys have any questions about alternatives, just let me know, and we'll be able to go through them. So basically, white's trying to clear off this pawn. If white ends up in the situation where he's 2 pawns ahead, I think that should be a win. So I think that's the goal of this. All this kind of maneuvering. It's really just to get white 2 pawns ahead. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it. So now knight to f4, bishop to e1, knight to g6, threatening the pawn, king d5, king g4, and yeah, and then basically this should be this basically should win. The book doesn't even play it out from this point. Hey, you're up late, Smiggy. Can 2 pawns and a king versus a king ever draw? The answer to that is yes, if they're if they're doubled, yeah. No, I think otherwise, I think basically, we could try to set up a position where there was, there was a drawing chances, but I think the answer is no. I think, basically 2 pawns will always be able to win against the king. I can show you a good technique for it. I'll take a look, and I can basically show you a situation and a technique for that after this game. But basically, here's what the value of this game was. This is basically one of those games in the chapter where they're sort of demonstrating a particular concept. They're basically saying, okay, so we're in a knight and bishop endgame. So what's a characteristic that definitely wins for one side? And in this case, basically, white having this outside passed pawn. Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question, Smiggy. I think thank you for asking it. But yeah, basically, this 2 extra pawns versus or 2 extra pawns versus a king, I think should always be a win for the 2 pawn side. I could try to think of a position where it isn't, but I'm pretty sure that it always is. Maybe if I'm trying to think just like if there's a way that, if the king is, maybe if the pawns are on g6 and h7, then I feel like the king could still maneuver around it. Hey, how are you, 251? But yeah, so anyways, we're looking, we'll set that up in a second, Smiggy, because I'm kind of curious about it. But yeah, I'm curious about, I'm actually, now that I think about that position, maybe if the pawns are on g6 and like b6 and a7, and the king's already on a8 defending, that would be probably the most extreme situation, and I think maybe that would be a draw. But we'll take a look in a second, Smiggy. Anyways, I've never actually thought about that question in those terms before. But basically, this pawn from c6, c7, this pawn pushing forward and trying to queen over here is going to let the white king basically advance and take pawns on the king side. So what we see actually really good technique in this game. So this pawn on the c file is something that basically black has to deal with at some point. If he threatens it with the bishop, then the pawn will definitely go to c6. And then the king will have to be the one that takes it. So basically the black king is going to have to be the piece that takes this pawn. But when the black king takes this pawn, the white king's going to be able to get over to like e4 and d5, and then be able to play knight takes e5, and then move in on the king side pawns here. So that's exactly what happened in this game. But yeah, so when this actually happens, when this bishop plays to e7, the pawn plays to c6, and the king goes over, this king's going to be able to get into the king side and basically block off this king, which is now displaced, having to deal with that passed pawn, and basically be able to get in. So pawn takes, king. So I mean, I think that just that general concept is what they're trying to highlight here. Like this c pawn, basically it overrides every other strength on the board. With this, white king can basically go f3, e4, d5, and get in on these black kingside pawns. Yeah, exactly right, Smiggy. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. That's exactly how to describe this position. And yeah, it's basically using the white pawn on the c file to like decoy the black king into moving over to the queen side. And then when it gets to the queen side, then white's king can come in and take all the pawns on the king side. If white gets 2 pawns ahead, it's pretty much a win. The book doesn't even play it out from the situation where it's a knight and 2 pawns versus a bishop, which is kind of interesting. I'll show you where the book ends this analysis, but basically the main idea is white's going to use this pawn to get 2 pawns up on the king side. That's really what's going on here. So pawn takes, king c6, and then what's going to end up happening is this king's not going to be able to get over to the king side, because this white king will be blocking it, and then this white king will be able to take the f pawn first and then the h pawn second, and then white's going to have 2 pawns to black 0 pawns. So yeah, king to e6, knight to d4, and then basically, white ends up in a situation where he ends up 2 pawns to nothing. So the game just ends here. Basically white's kept this black king over into this situation, and basically white can play knight takes h4, and then if bishop takes h4, king takes h4, but the pawns get passed. So the book doesn't even bother playing it out from here. It basically assesses this as a win, or it assesses whatever the next move is, say king to e6, knight takes h4. It just says this is a win here, and that's sort of interesting. I feel like this is the type of situation where you probably are won as white, but you'd have to play very carefully in practice. I'll just run a report here, but basically it should be about 2.5 pawns up, and yeah, this game this game ends in a win for white. But it isn't so super obvious like how this is supposed to conclude as an advantage for white. So yeah, Smiggy asks a really good question. But anyways, this basically is this is a win. The game. I guess my disagreement with the board is, or the piece end game is basically saying the book just ends this end game here and says white is won. I would say there's still technique involved in winning this end game as white. Up 2 pawns, but I understand it. I mean, I think you could probably force this to be a win. In practice, I'm pretty sure you would win this even without, training heavily to it. Yeah, so good question. There's no pawns. There's no way to lose this game for sure, because the king and the bishop have the only, pieces for black. So there's no way that white could ever lose this game. But the game just says, okay, or the book just says, okay, basically this is for sure winning for white. Yeah, so that's a really good question. Let's take a look at it, Smiggy. Really interesting question. And yeah, we'll take a look at it now. I was sort of stuck on that endgame position, but yeah, let's look at it. Okay. So in this situation, the closest situation I'm sure 2 pawns can win is this one, where the pawns are already advanced on b6 and a7. And the black king and the white king is on c4. So I'm just trying to think of how white would win this. Let's see. So here the engine says basically white is winning. So I don't know. I guess I'm sort of curious about this because to me it's not so obvious, right? I mean, how's the white king? So this king is going to be bouncing between b7 and a8. So that's clearly the defensive tactic for black. And let's just figure out how exactly white capitalizes on this. Because, to me, king b7, a8, rook. Okay, yeah, all right, so that's how you do it. Okay, that took me a second. Yeah, so basically what you do, this is the closest situation that I can think of where 2 pawns might draw. But I've never actually thought about that question before, which just means it's a great question. But yeah. What you do here is you basically turn it into a so queen there, king to c6, king to b8, b7, king to a7, king to c7. So yeah, I guess I'd never thought about that before. So yeah, I guess I'm pretty comfortable saying that 2 pawns always beats a king and a pawn. That was the closest. That was the closest idea that I had. Let's see the other way. I mean, maybe. But no, I mean, it's a win for the side with 2 pawns. But I'm still kind of interested. We can set it up the other way just to demonstrate it. Yeah. So in this case, this king is here, king is here, king is here, and white king is here. So I guess what I would say here is this should also be a pretty clear, this should be a clear way to win. So this king plays here to king c6. King c6, king a7, king c7 here. So king a6, king a7, king to c7. And this is pretty straightforward. The king you basically just force the king to take the one that's in, basically behind, and then queen this one. So yeah, so I guess I would say that's the overall situation. That ends up in a situation where white is basically better and winning. So yeah, really interesting situation, really interesting question. But yeah, those are the two situations I would think where white would have the best, or black would have the best drawing chances, and both of those are wins for white. Just to go back on the first one, just to take a look at it again, the closest situation that I could even think of was just having the pawns on a7 and b6, and the king already on a8. But then you just basically queen the pawn as white. So you have to be careful. You can't ever play c6 and you can't ever play a6 with the king while the two pawns are on the board. But you wait until the king comes to b7. So king to c5, king to b7, a8 queen, king takes, king c6, and then goes in that direction. So that's how that's the answer to that question. It's a good question though. I probably should have had a more certain answer, but I've never actually thought about it in that way before. I have always just sort of assumed that two pawns versus a king would win. But yeah, no, it's a good question. I was thinking, I assume that two pawns against a king is always going to win, but I've never actually tried the most extreme cases on that. But yeah. Well, no. So, the thing about it is, right. I mean, the thing is, the king's best defensive strategy for black here is always going to be just bouncing between b7 and b6. So you'll have, or b7 and a8. So you'll always have the opportunity to take, to move your king over. So like if the king starts over in the, on h1 instead, this king's still going to be going between these two squares, and then you can just march the king in while it's taking tempo doing that. So that's the answer to that question. But good question, interesting thing. I didn't really have a memorized response to that. I had to actually think about it. So good question, and taking a look. And also, if you have any other endgame questions, or if anyone else has any endgame questions, I'm super happy to just look through them. I was thinking, these are basically all endgame studies that I was looking at. I have these prepared ones, which are ones pretty much that I wanted to look at. But if anyone has any questions, please let me know. Why are endgames so complicated? I think they're one of those things that you basically have specific techniques that you can use. And what's valuable about going through a book like Basic Chess Endgames is, Basic Chess Endings, this really old one by Fine that I consider to be like one of the real classic endgame books, is they basically show you different tricks that you can do. I think basically you can figure out some of the things that you're supposed to do intuitively, but there are ones that are basically trying to demonstrate specific concepts. Like you can basically go through this book, and at least the version that I have has somewhere between 1,000 and 1,100 end games, and each one of them is trying to at least illustrate a new technique. So I don't know if there's 1,000 distinct techniques, but there's probably 250 distinct techniques, and you can just go through the book front to back and like learn them. Like I think basically the first one that we were looking at already, which was basically this one that I was showing you, where this pawn on the c5 pawn allows this king to come forward on f3, e4, d5, and basically uses this pawn as a decoy in order to basically get the king to take the kingside pawns. That's like a good demonstration of a specific technique. If you go through this book, you'll see many techniques that you can go through basically from front to back. And basically that this is a really good book for that. If you have the time, which in my life I haven't, but I'm excited because now I actually have a stream that's kind of oriented towards it, so I have a good excuse to do it. With that, you can basically play f3, or in this case, you have this specific technique, this f3, e4, d5 technique, and you can find something similar in every other position in here. There's a reason why every position is in this game. They're all drawn from like very high level games, and they're very helpful in terms of learning specific techniques. So let's take a look at this one. This is another, this is basically another bishop and knight, or bishop and knight one. In this one, we can take a look at it. Okay, so what's going on here basically? I think this is another one where you basically have a, where you basically have an outside passed pawn. This C pawn is sort of similar to the C pawn in the last one, and it's basically about figuring out whether this king is going to be able to get to C4, D4, king to E5. I mean, basically whether white can, or basically whether white can end up winning the pawn on C6 in order to win this game. So yeah, so this is interesting, and let's take a look. It's white to move, and white has the winning strategy here. This king can't catch up to this pawn, basically. This pawn is white to move, so this white pawn starts off the puzzle with C6, then E5, then F5, which is probably the weirdest move of all. So why F5 here? Interesting. Let's take a look at this. F5 looks really interesting. I guess the value of F5 is to keep this king sort of able to defend this pawn. Pawn takes F4 would be a problem. And on bishop takes F5, which is definitely something that's required, this knight goes to D6 and then threatens the bishop, like, with tempo. So then this knight, basically this pawn can play to C7 and then C8. But yeah, let's just play this out, because F5 is a surprising move. I think it'll make more sense in context. Right. So you get knight D6 with tempo, which is definitely a key move in this. So yeah, but I'm still sort of confused because what I think might happen is I think what might happen is threats on the king side. Yeah, so say F5, bishop takes F5, knight to D6, so knight to D6, sorry, I think I messed this up, sorry, my fault, C6, E5, man, sorry about that, C6, king to B5, C7, E5, F5. Sorry, I made a small mistake there. F5, bishop takes F5, forced. Knight to D6, king to C6, knight takes, king takes C7, knight takes G7. So this is what actually happened in the game. I'm sort of, yeah, this one makes more sense. Yeah, that's my bad. Sorry, I just I transposed this wrong. I looked at the wrong line in the book. But yeah, C6. Okay, so C6. But the main point is still sort of the same, which is basically that this this king can't catch that pawn. If it's just the king, then yeah, it makes a lot more sense that way, right? But yeah, so C6, king to B5, C7, E5, and now F5 makes perfect sense, right? Now basically, the idea of, I'm still sort of curious. Okay, so we see here that F5, bishop takes F5, knight to D6, king C6, knight takes, and then threats on G7, right? And then basically white will clear off the pawns from black and will win. So, king to C7 here, knight takes G7. But yeah, this should pretty clearly be a win for white. Basically this king will go back and defend this pawn. This knight will be able to, clear off, basically between the king and the knight, white's going to be able to clear off all of black's pawns. And then once he does that, he'll be able to queen the pawn with, basically the support of the king and the knight on the H-file. So that is a win for white. What I'm a little bit curious about here, though, is king to B5, C7, E5, and then in this situation, I'm sort of curious about why they don't like D6 or knight to D6 here. That's what I'm curious about, because knight to D6, right? I would figure that in this situation, knight to D6, king to C6, C8, bishop takes C8, knight takes C8. This line, so knight to D6, king to C6, C8, bishop takes, knight takes, e takes F4. I would figure that this would have kind of the same outcome, but they actually have this line, and they're saying that, basically with these three pawns, this, these pawns get connected and they draw. I guess I believe that. No, I think it's the fact that the pawns are connected. So what happens in the first one? Basically this d6 f5. This pawn is able to be clipped by the king later. So this king can go like d3, e4, and then take the pawn on e5. I think that's the reasoning behind it. So basically this after the bishop comes off the board, this pawn isn't able to be defended, and then these pawns will fall as well. What they really need is for the pawns to be isolated here, right? So what happens in this line, the winning line, is that you basically get the situation where you have the two pawns isolated here, and then you can kind of maneuver the king and knight, so and neither one of them can be defended. They don't actually provide a line for why knight to d6 here. So this knight to d6 line, they don't really actually provide a line in the book for why this is a draw, but I have to think it has to do with basically these pawns being able to form form a defense of each other, and then also things like h5 and then pushing hard on the g file, and basically I think these three pawns together are far enough advanced. Yeah. Right. So I think basically the idea here is that you just use these three pawns to start an attack on the h2 pawn, and as black here, you really only need to clear one of the pawn, or you only have one pawn to get rid of. It's this h pawn, and with pawns on f, g, and h files, I think that you should be able to get this h pawn off the board for white, and then once you do that, then you know for sure that you're drawn, right? So I think it's basically that. I think that a big piece of this was getting that these pawns isolated, and they play out the continuation to this. This is basically where the line ends, and I agree with this. I think this is pretty safely a win for white. Black can't defend either pawn, and white's going to end up being able to use his king and knight together for each of them to try to get that to get those pawns off the board. So yeah, that's interesting. That's an interesting situation, and yeah, I mean, but the drawing line, the one without this, black ends up with a much better pawn structure, and one that in itself is able to clear off the h pawn. I think that's the drawing strategy there, but interesting too. Yeah, so basically this one was sort of fell under the topic of like endgame tactics. King to b5, c7, and e5, and then you're lucky enough as white to basically have this endgame tactic of bishop taking f5, knight to d6. That's I guess the main point here is probably looking at which lines drew and which ones win. The lines in which these three pawns end up connected and forcing the h pawn off the board, those are the ones that draw. This tactic is cool, but basically, at the end of the game, I barely feel like this is even kind of an endgame puzzle. It was an endgame puzzle that uses the idea of this outside passed pawn and uses the idea of a minor piece, but it ends up winning because this pawn structure, without isolated pawns, the F file, G file, H file pawn structure can force a draw with white only having that one pawn. Basically, I don't know. I think it's kind of a weird puzzle, like a weird problem, because basically the minor piece component of this puzzle ends here, right? But the understanding of the knight versus pawn endgame is really what kind of determines the outcome here. Like, basically the whole point of the puzzle in my mind is to figure out why, f5 is good, but knight to d6 is bad. That's I think the point of this puzzle, but that's not really a minor piece endgame puzzle. This is just kind of a king and pawn. It's basically a king and pawn puzzle. We're showing off how weak these isolated pawns are against a minor piece, as opposed to the situation where you end up with connected pawns against the minor piece. It's like the real value of this puzzle was the connected pawns versus the minor piece, as opposed to the unconnected pawns, the isolated pawns versus the minor piece. Yeah. I mean, these are great. I honestly there's lots of stuff here. I feel bad. Like, I've gone so long in chess without without going through these books, and it's great to actually have a chance to do it now. Anyways, this is another one. So basically, this is a pawn structure that's pretty fractured for black. White has 2 pawn islands, basically B and A files, and then E through H files, and black has 3 pawn islands and a bishop. Black's bishop isn't particularly strong here, and basically, it's kind of a good question of how to convert this into a win for white. White's also up a pawn. So white has a pawn up and a better pawn structure. So how does white convert this into a win? So the endgame, or this book describes a pretty good description. So it says that if black does nothing, then white's plan is to march his king to b6 or c7. So he wants to get his king over in this direction, and then basically win b7. And then play knight to c5 as well to win b7. The pawns are all on dark squares, so they sort of defend themselves reasonably well, all together as white. Like if white's pawns are all in the wrong color square for the bishop, then white's king is just going to be there. So basically, the book is describing an ideal situation which black isn't playing, and then shows that white can basically march over to b6 or c7. And then the black king, if there's no defense there, white will win the b7 pawn by using the knight on c5. Okay, so interesting. So black has to basically stop this threat in some way, because this is the optimal threat for white, the optimal white situation, and black needs to figure out how to solve this. So let's look at the game line. So king to f2, f5, knight to c3. So that's kind of interesting. Three. A few. I mean, I don't know. I guess there were no alternatives there that would have led to white being able to maintain a knight to c5 on the next move. So I guess this is fine. Okay. e5. Yeah, good question. Yeah, absolutely. And if you guys have, yeah, of course, you guys can totally ask any questions that you want. Yeah, or tell me your strategies on games that you send. Yeah, I'm basically here to teach. So please, if you have any questions or anything like that, just feel free to ask questions. The way to send games in, I'll show you, is on the Discord buzzer. And yeah, so this Discord exists, and you can submit the games in the game submission section of the Discord, and they'll be on. Yeah, I gotta fix that automatic Discord thing. I'll try to figure that out tomorrow. I was very busy today, but I'll try to figure that out tomorrow. That's not the first day that I've said that, but I'll try to figure out that Discord, those automated commands tomorrow. But yeah, send over any games that you have on that Discord in the game submission section. And we're a bit backlogged at the minute, but I'm hoping somewhere around a week we can definitely take a look at them. I got to figure out a better system, because it seems like we're getting backlogged, and some of the games are multiple games, which is cool. I mean, it's great that people are interested, but yeah, just send it on the game submission section. You can see on the game submission section everyone else who's sent in games, and yeah, definitely send in some games, and they'll be on the stream before too long. But we do have a lot of games that are sent in right now. Anyways, I'll figure out. I think I'm gonna figure out a new kind of strategy for that. But anyways, yeah, feel free. This is just an endgame study, and also in the live game reviews, feel free to just ask any questions that you have. Like a lot of these lines you end up going through pretty quickly. So yeah, if anyone has questions, it's super helpful for me in terms of my understanding to see kind of to think about it from other people's perspectives. And yeah, I'm also getting a lot out of this in the sense that I get to learn these positions, and yeah, no problem at all, Buzzer. I'm glad that that's helpful, and yeah, no, I get to learn these. I get to learn a lot from this. Honestly, I feel like I've improved a lot. Both my endgames and my opening understanding's gotten a lot better from doing this. So e5, king to e2, e takes f4. E takes f4, king d6. So basically, this is what black's idea. We showed the idea of basically this king getting in through b6 and c7, and then pairing it with knight to c5 in order to win the b7 pawn. So this is black's attempt to prevent that. Yeah, you never know. It would be cool. There's a lot of learned stuff in chess that I just never really had an opportunity to go through. But doing that on the stream is great. The there's specific books that I think are better for the stream than others, but yeah, these old endgame books, man, I never had a chance to go through these, so now I'm getting to learn a lot. So yeah, king to d6, b4, bishop to d7. So basically, they have kind of an aside here, and they say, why doesn't Black try to exchange his king side or his weak queen side pawns? Like, why is he not interested in trading his H pawn and F pawn for White's, F pawn and G pawn or something, or G pawn and H pawn, I guess it would be. And the answer for that is basically because, hey, thank you very much for the follow ID. Thank you very much for joining the stream. Thanks for being here. So yeah, so this idea, so basically trading off this F pawn and this H pawn for this G pawn and this H pawn, that ends up into a situation where, basically the white king can get into the king side. So they have this sideline drawn out, this G and H pawn drawn up against F pawn and H pawn, and yeah, so in this case, if instead, so king to c6, they have the sideline king to c6, king to d3, b6, a takes b6, king takes b6, king to d4, a5, b takes. Oh, wait, sorry. Sorry. Okay, so b4, then bishop to, and another alternative, the exchanging the white queenside pawn. So here c6 to c6, king to d3, b6, a takes b6, king takes b6, king d4, a5, b takes, king takes, king to e5. They were basically saying, why doesn't white try to his pawns, an a pawn for white's b pawn and a pawn, and that's because that in there to support that. And then with the king getting in, white's able to move into the king side. So that's what that is. And yeah, I guess here, so that's the line that came in. Instead of b4, b4, bishop d7, king to e3, bishop to c6, g3, bishop d7, king to d4. And mainly the idea here, I guess I would say, is the first two steps. So I didn't really understand what they were mean by first two steps, but basically White's going to end up in a situation where he can play moves like knight to d5, knight to f6, knight to g8, and knight takes h6. But White's making pressure to it to advance. This king's basically been on the 6th rank since the start of this puzzle, or start of this study. And White's king has gotten in there without much opposition. So I'm thinking that the knight to d5 and then knight to e3 probably could be good. I'm trying to just think of which pawn's best to win, as White here. So maybe ideas like so basically Black can't move any of his pawns. So I think White's going to be able to use like Zugzwang type improvements here. Knight to d5, knight to f6, and basically threats on the pawns on the king side. I think that will be helpful for White. I think that's the tactic. But I'm sort of curious here because the initial tactic that the book was talking about was basically the king getting in through c5, king getting in through b6, and then threats on b7 with knight to c5. So yeah, that's definitely an idea. I think that's a solid way to go. But yeah, I'm curious to see which of the pawns that the white king actually ends up clipping here. Cool. So on to the next thing. This is after bishop to d4 or king to d4. Now bishop to e6. And yeah, I guess what they're thinking is, basically having this threat of this passed pawn is valuable for white. So, basically at any point, if black trades off his bishop for the knight, then white's going to be able to do things like play g4, pawn takes g4, and basically, go for a passed pawn on the king side. So the black basically is forced to keep the minor pieces on. Otherwise, bad things are going to start to happen. So yeah, I think with king to d4, ideas. So the constant threat of a passed pawn brings about black's downfall. He can't ever trade the bishop for the knight. And then the bishop can't go too far, away from the king side. The king side needs to be continued to be defended by the bishop. I guess that's the point of this, position. Knight can play to d5. Knight can play to e3. But the two things that need to happen for black is black can basically never trade off the bishop, and also or it can never trade the bishop for the knight, and also has to keep his bishop relatively close to the king side just to defend things. It's very helpful here too that white has all of his pawns on the wrong color for the bishop. That's pretty helpful here. But yeah, overall interesting situation. Does knight want to go to c5? Yeah, potentially. I basically think that the knight can come to c5. We looked at the initial position, right? And basically what they're talking about in terms of the initial position, by the way, the king starts on the 7th rank and this king starts on the 1st rank. But white's going to be able to go up and, basically the analysis was if black is stuck here, like if there's no real, improvements for black, white can go up to c5 and then b6 and then play knight to c5. This is the way that white can advance in this situation, move the knight to c5. So I think that tactic's going to continue to be there, 251. It's a really good question. Thank you for asking it. And yeah, I mean, I think basically there, ideas moving the knight up to b6 and then moving the knight to c5. I think that's going to be solid for white, and that is interesting. That's basically an interesting question. Good question. Yeah, feel free to ask as many questions as you want. I'm always happy to hear them. And yeah, they're really helpful in terms of thinking about these positions. So please let me know. Okay, so bishop to e6, knight to a4, h5, knight to c5, bishop d5, knight to d7. Okay, so they get this kind of silly tactic in, right? Like knight to d7, forcing the king off of the defensive d5. But basically, knight to d7 is usable as a maneuvering square for the knight because the king can't take it, right? So yeah, that ends up being a good place for this knight. I'm wondering about on the bishop to g3 line, which I assume is what's played here now. So knight to d7, or bishop, because I'm curious about bishop to g3. Then what's the tactic for white? The tactic for white, okay, then it's knight to c5. So if the bishop goes to g2, then the knight goes to c5 and threatens the b7 pawn corresponding to the h3 pawn. White's fine trading off a pawn here. That wouldn't be a problem. So yeah, instead, bishop to b3, knight to e5, bishop to c2, knight to c4, king c6, knight to e3, and yeah, now this knight is forking this this bishop on c2 and this knight and this pawn on f5. Bishop b1, knight d1, king d6, knight to c3, bishop to c2. Interesting. So yeah, I'm just looking for advancement possibilities for white. Instead of king e5. Yeah, I mean, white doesn't necessarily have the ability to zugzwang black, right? Because, black has the full range of motion for his bishop. So white has to sort of decide what to do here. So with 16 bishop to c2, yeah, I mean, basically, I think this will become clear in a second. So let's look. White's going to go in on the king side, or on the queen side here, and play b5, I think. I think that's what's about to happen. but let's take a look. So king to c4, king to c6, h4, and king to d6, b5, a takes b5, knight takes b5, king to e7, king to c5, bishop to e4, knight to d6, and then resignation here. Interesting. Yeah, so definitely. Yeah, I think Black's wise to resign here. I think that looks good. I think that this is sufficient for White to win. I don't think so. So basically, Black has basically failed, right? He's failed in his ability to defense. To defense this. So yeah. Couldn't White move the king over to e5 to win the f pawn? Let's take a look. So yeah, king to f2, f5, knight to c3, e5, king e2, and yeah, basically this this structure on this side for White. This ends up being a good way for White to play this, but when the knight was on e3, you're asking. Yeah, let's take a look. So the knight's on e3, and sorry, 1 second. 1 second. There we go. Okay, cool. Yeah. So this. Yeah. So when the knight's on e3, sure. Yeah. Let's take a look at that. Okay. So the knight's on e3 here, right? So you're asking, when the knight was on e3, couldn't White move the king over to e5 to win the f pawn? So play king to the f file as opposed to, or king to the e file as opposed to moving the knight over. Good question. They don't have that sideline in this book. But yeah, let's think about this for a bit. Yeah. So yeah, right. Good. I mean, good question. So when we're thinking about this, what should White do here? I guess. So king's on c6, and then knight. I guess the knight has the possibility of the king has the possibility of going to e5. I mean, obviously it's going to be so knight to e3, bishop to b1, then king to e5. One move further than this. Okay, here. Yeah, you're talking about here. Okay. Yeah, let's look. Knight played to d1 instead. Yeah, the engine seems to like that. I mean, keep in mind this is, that looks fine to me. Keep in mind this is like a really old book. So yeah. Knight to d1 is played in order to defend against king to b5. But yeah, I mean, we can play it out. Let's play out the engine line here. But yeah, you're right. King to b5. No, I don't think so. I think it's fine. Basically, I think that this endgame situation ends up, it's a win either way, right? Is the main point. But king e5 might be an improvement. So let's look king to e5, king to b5, knight takes, and then White's gonna be able to get his pawn advanced here and queen, I assume, right? Let's take a look at the engine line. Knight d4. This should be enough for White to win. Hey, thank you very much for the follow, Vim. Appreciate it. Thanks for joining. Well, yeah. I mean, if the bishop hangs itself for some reason, knight to b3 seems like a bad move. I'm not sure why that's the engine. Why that's the engine's idea. But king to d8, knight to f5, king to e8. Yeah, I think overall this should just be good for White. So yeah, it's a good question. No, you definitely weren't. Always feel free to ask these questions. They're super helpful for me to think about. So yeah, no, king to e5 is playable. If we look at the engine lines here after bishop to b1. Knight to d5 is actually, knight to d1 isn't even on the list. Knight to d1 is like 4 points better. But yeah, king to e5 is fine. Knight to d5 is fine. There's a lot of different moves that will win for White here, but king to e5 is just fine. It's not what happened in the game. And I guess yeah, um, yeah, potentially. You'd have to blame, Fine was, Fine's about 50 years dead, I think. So, let's see what year Fine died. Uh, uh, he died. Oh, he only died in 1993. That's actually pretty good. But yeah, so yeah, interesting question. But yeah, I thought he was even earlier than that. But anyways, take it up with him. This is my this basically I think this will work as well. But yeah, you're right. The line that the book gives is not the most straightforward one. To my eyes either. I mean, I think the king to e5, knight takes f5 will be just fine for white, and yeah, I think that ends up being a win for white. So interesting question, good question, and yeah, let's go back to the beginning. Just do this one more time. Basically, white's able to exploit the fact that this bishop is tied to the king side, and move his king. Basically this king's advanced 4 times and this king's only advanced once. Black has very limited ability to make progress in this position because at any point he tries to go over and start taking the pawns, white's going to come in, on the opposing side and start taking more important pawns. So black never really has the ability to leave the 6th rank or the center of the board, and white does. So that's basically how it comes. That's basically how it concludes, and yeah, very interesting stuff, I think. Threats on d5 are good, and yeah, ultimately the way that white wins, they give king to c5 a double blunder. They say king to d. I mean, just so as long as we're looking at engine analysis, king to d5 is way better than what the book gives as king to c5. But yeah, whatever. Bishop to d4, knight to d6, and white's winning by any means. So, anyways, interesting game, interesting conclusion, and yeah. These endgame studies are really interesting, I think. It's cool. We get to learn new tactics. We get to learn new kind of maneuverings. It's material that I've wanted to go over for a long time, so it's great to have an opportunity. Anyways, let's get on to the game reviews for tonight. I thought that was pretty interesting stuff, and yeah, let's take a look. Cool. So this is Jay Keogh's game. Jay Keogh is on the Discord. But yeah, I think this overall plays out pretty interestingly. Jay Keogh has an interesting name. And yeah, let's take a look. At this from the black side. Okay, so cool. So d4, pawn takes e4, and this, this is not a good response to the Scandinavian, I don't think. Cool. Yeah, cool. Thank you very much for the follow, JFK. I appreciate it. Thanks very much for joining the stream. Yeah. So yeah. E4 Scandinavian, d4, pawn takes e4. And black is in a good situation here. White can play things like knight to c3, but overall, this is just sort of a gambit that that isn't that. I guess I would say that isn't that helpful for white. Basically recapturing the e4 pawn should be something that white will be able to do eventually, but gambiting a center pawn, without having a really discernible way of advancing your attack, is not super clear. So instead, this is a gambit that I know exists. I forget what this is called, like second gambit, Gedult gambit. What happens on pawn takes f3? It's some crazy line. I don't know. Black. I guess this is just the Blackmar gambit. Is that what they call it? Knight to c6. So here, basically, the main line is knight to c3. F3 also exists as a line, this Gedult gambit, but I didn't know. I've never seen that played. I have seen e4 played a couple times, but I don't remember f3. Knight to f6, knight to c3, and then black. Basically black's moves here. Things like knight to c6 is playable. But e takes f3 at this point is the most common. This turn takes us into the Blackmar-Diemer gambit. Basically, the sacrifice of e4 and f3. Black Mardemer Gambit is what that's called. Yeah, pretty. I guess I don't know. I'm not convinced that this offers much for white. Your development, I guess, is a little better. You have a knight out first. I mean, but clearing your f file is not super valuable. Yeah, I mean, I've seen these kinds of gambits from time to time, Black Mardemer Gambit, but it's kind of funny. We've gone over this before on the stream, but the truth of the matter is that, at the end of it, at the end of the day, like, once you get to like 2,000, 2,200, people just stop trying things against you. Like, it's actually a really good practice to go over like the Black Mardemer Gambit. Like, I see that so infrequently that I don't even know what to. Well, first I play knight to f6, so I don't actually play d5 anymore. Or I don't play 1d5 anymore. So that's part of it. But it's kind of amazing. People just stop playing kind of junky gambits against you. Not saying that these gambits aren't like, are refuted or like, nah, because in Bullet they just don't even try opening theory. It's kind of interesting, if you played like, maybe if you played Blitz online, you would see it occasionally, but like, over the board, people never try crazy gambits against you after you reach about 2,000. And then Bullet, they don't even bother to play openings. And even if they did bother to play openings, that's they usually go for like, very well-known openings. But anyways, the question is they barely even play Bullet. They barely play openings of any kind in Bullet. But yeah, people stop trying things against you. That's why I think, one of the funniest. I've talked about this before on the stream too, but there was a funny time when I saw a kid who was about 2150 playing like an old international master, and he played the Elephant Gambit against the guy and like won. Like, it was like amazing. It was actually really funny because no one ever tries those things against really high level players, so they don't get much practice against it. And it's like, yeah, people have like seen it, a couple times in their life, and like they sort of remember vaguely, like, but they really the Elephant Gambit, which is a game with like some prepared traps and tactical opportunities for black, beat an IM. Watching a 2150 beat an IM out of the Elephant Gambit was really a memorable thing for me. So that's sort of what I remember on that topic. But the main point is that once you get to about 2,000, people stop playing this stuff against you. I encourage people to try it against me. I'm sure I'm underprepared for it. Anyways, Black Mardemer Gambit here. Instead of the main line, black plays knight to f6. The main line, I guess, is here. It's e takes f3. Here, black plays knight to c6. This is the deviation from theory. In this situation, knight to c6 has only been played once, and the game, there've been over 400 games. So knight to c6 is an unusual move. Let's see how it does in terms of eval. I think this qualifies for getting removed from eval. Basically, we've come up with this practice of looking at games and seeing if an opening move is played less than 1% of the time. If an opening move is played less than 1% of the time, and it leads to an eval difference of over half a pawn versus the best move. So in this case, e takes f3 leads to an eval of minus 0.5 or so, somewhere between minus 0.5 and minus 0.75. Well, so here's the thing. I have a simul this weekend, which I would really like you guys to play in. I also have a tournament series where I'm at least going to play a game or two from each of the tournaments. So yeah, please come back. I'm not going to play tonight, but please come back tomorrow for the morning stream at 8 a.m. And then we're having a tournament where I'll play at least a few games at 9:45 a.m. Eastern. But if you really want to play for sure, Vim, I'm doing a simul this weekend. I'm shooting for 50 people. We'll see what happens. But yeah, I'm doing a simul on my time zone is Eastern Standard Time, EST. But I'm doing a simul at 3 p.m. EST, And just by the way, that's GMT minus 5, I think. I think that's either GMT minus 4 or GMT minus 5 versus, based on whether it's daylight savings. But yeah, I'm doing a simul this weekend at 3 p.m. Eastern time after my class ends. And yeah. Okay, so GMT minus 4. I'm doing a simul, 50 people, hopefully. Definitely be ready to play me then. So yeah. Cool. How's Okay, and then I do a simul every Tuesday, Vim. I do a simul at 8:45 a.m. Eastern time, which is so 8:45 a.m. Eastern, which I guess is about 6 hours earlier. So yeah, come by for the simul on Tuesday. Tuesday morning, I have a simul. I'm gonna do a simul every week with a that's gonna be at 8:45 a.m. Eastern time. So that should be about 8:45 p.m. for you, I guess, Vim. Yeah, it should be then. I'll be around for a simul on Tuesday morning. Keep that in mind. But that will be a time when we can play for sure. If you don't manage to play me in any of the tournaments. But we're doing tournaments at 9:45 a.m. Eastern, and I'm gonna try to play a round or two from each of those. So you'll have plenty of opportunities to play me them. I just can't do it right now. So yeah, John Keogh here, c6, bishop to d3, bishop to g4, and basically here, your ideas are, I guess I would say here that knight to c6 threatens d4, so white needs to do something about this. But the idea is, the idea basically is that there's a difference of about half a pawn, or more than half a pawn, and the openings played less than 1% of the time. So after pawn takes f3, then knight takes f3 becomes, basically between 0.5 and 0.75 better for black. Pawn takes f3, and that's the eval for black. With the optimal move, pawn takes f3 being played. Knight to c6 is played less than 1% of the time, and it leads to an edge of, I think a little bit for white, like plus 2.2 or plus 0.3 for white. I'm pretty sure this ends up being, weak enough that it actually fails on that screening criteria. I think it leads to a winning eval for white, but anyways, whether or not it fits our kind of rigidly defined criteria or not, it's definitely flagged for removal. It's not as good. Pawn takes f3 is the main line. Knight to c6 is some weird sideline that's unnamed. So I would say pawn takes f3 is what black is supposed to play here. Going forward, pawn takes f3 here. Knight to c6, pawn takes e4, knight takes. And yeah, I guess what I would say here is that black is just a pawn and a quarter better or something. Knight can play knight takes f3. Black can play e5 to kind of strengthen this position. But yeah, black's better. I mean, white is more or less a pawn down with nothing to show for it, as well as having a worse pawn structure. I mean, white has 6 pawns and a worse pawn structure. Black has 7 pawns. So overall, black's doing well here. Queen takes, knight takes, pawn c6. All this seems pretty good. Bishop takes c3 is an error, but we'll come back to it. But bishop takes c3 is an error. And a4 is an error. The reason why a4 is an error: rook takes d8, rook takes d8, rook takes h3, pawn takes b3, pawn takes b3. Yeah, that looks somewhat close to equalizing. Here, rook to a8 is probably the best, and then rook takes 8. Yeah, rook to a8, a4, b takes a4, b takes a4, king to g7 maybe. But yeah, this isn't much better for black. Black had better continuations. And yeah, I mean, I think black just ends up winning this game. So let's take a look at for John Keogh here. We have this opportunity. So basically, white plays this weird opening. You want to play pawn takes f3 over knight to c6. This knight to c6 just isn't a good opening line. It runs into it can run into d5 immediately, and basically this d5 leads to this black knight having to relocate to a less good position. Knight to b8, knight to e5, but something. But white fortunately makes an error here. But anyways, take knight to c6 out of your opening repertoire. It's not the right move. The right move here is pawn takes f3. Bishop to f5 looks like it's played in a number of situations. That looks like a way of defending the pawn and making the exchange take place on e4 as opposed to f3. But yeah, I think basically here pawn takes f3 is probably a better way to go about this. Pawn takes f3 is the main line. So knight to c6, and then after white gives black this center, black is fine. Knight takes, pawn takes, queen d1. And yeah, black is just, things are going well for black smoothly, and yeah, things are good. So 2 errors here. The first is bishop takes c3 does worsen white's pawn structure. That said, it's not worth doing. This doubled, these doubled bishops, right, going against c3. This is a big error for white. So bishop takes c3, pawn takes c3, king to f8, and yeah, this I think is going to end up being this is going to be less good for black than just leaving the bishops on the board. Things like king to f8, king e7. And like bishop to e6, this will end up in a situation where black has a comfortable position. This position's relatively open. I think that basically maybe f5 could be helpful, but basically the idea is that keeping the bishop pair on the board will be good for black. So that's what I'm saying. Things like f5. This will end up in a situation where black will be okay. Instead, white has ended up, white ends up with worse pawn structure and same colored bishops, so black still has winning chances, but he no longer has the advantage of the bishop pair. So I think that that's an error for black, that black should have played differently. And then the last error, I think, yeah, so your thought here was to take the d file with the rook. Okay, yeah, sure, let's take a look. So yeah, I mean, I see no reason not to do that. Yeah, no, I like that idea. I like that idea, Jay. But I think that basically here, you're gonna end up in a situation where you're gonna end up in a situation here that's good. But I think that that the bishop pair was valuable to you. You may, yeah, I understand. All right, so that's actually really helpful. I understand your logic a lot better, JQ. But I think that that error there, or basically, I think that your idea of getting the undisputed, undisputed control of the D file, I think that was generally good. I like the idea, but I think that the cost of the bishop is too high for that. Bishop to d4, and then I don't know, not that's just not particularly strong for basically trading off your bishop pair isn't worth that single rook file, because the white rook will relocate to basically the A file. So you now have the rook on d8, so great. I mean, this is good, strong file for sure. But white will get corresponding strong files, I think. Anyways, this worked out great. So I guess I think that there was an error for white though. The first error. So this idea is good. So let's say if instead of a4, rook takes d1, king takes d1, rook to d8. Yeah, this looks good. I think that this is a solid continuation for black. Again, I'm not sure it was worth the cost of getting rid of the bishop pair, but I definitely understand this situation for black, and I think that with this rook on d8, yeah, this is a very powerful file for this rook. No disputes there. I think that's the right idea, and yeah, totally, Jay. Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for explaining that. I think that this is this does demonstrate it's fine. This is a very strong file for the rook, and you got it. So no doubt about it. But that ended up being a I don't think trading off two bishops for it, or trading off your bishop pair for it, was good. or was worth enough. That's the logic. You know, it definitely you're definitely recognizing a legitimate strength, but the cost that you're associating with that strength, I think, is too much. King f7, king to e7, bishop to e6. So this seems to be a good continuation for black. And yeah, not even with damaging the pawns. Probably not, realistically. I think that ideas, basically ideas like bishop to e6, king to f8, king to e7. This just ends up being this just ends up being a continuation that's fine. It's good for black. Black is winning, but I don't think that it's a good enough trade. So that's my thinking. I think that this ended up being kind of a misplay. I don't know. I don't know if it's a misplay. You're still up 3 pawns, so how much does it really matter at the end of the day? Like, I don't know, but yeah, this ends up being problematic. So a4 was the issue where white can basically equalize. He equalizes by playing rook takes d8, rook takes d8, rook takes a3, and then on pawn takes a3, pawn takes b3. And now the material situation is at least equal again. So this continuation, this a4 continuation, leads to something closer to equality. So I think instead, maybe trading off on d1 could be good. But playing a4, basically allows your opponent to win a pawn, right? I mean, you're taking, white takes this pawn on h3 for free, and your pawn takes this bishop on b3 for the cost of the a pawn. So this actually loses a pawn back for black. There's just a tactical thing here, right? Because rook takes d8 draws. So it wouldn't in the case that basically if white king plays some random move here, like say like king to e1. You wouldn't play king to e1, but here king to e1, and then pawn takes, rook takes a3, or rook takes d1 and then rook takes a3. Then yeah, sure, you've gotten the you've basically traded off the a pawns here. So king takes, rook takes. But this tactic actually voluntarily loses a pawn for black. So I think for that reason, a4 isn't playable. Rook takes d8, rook takes d8, pawn takes, and then rook takes, pawn takes b3, pawn takes b3, and white's equalized materially. So I think that was really, or that was a sideline that was not good for black. Fortunately, white doesn't go with that rook takes d8 tactic. Instead, white plays bishop to a2, and now you're back up to being about 4 pawns up. This is good. So, yeah, interesting situation. Hey, thank you very much for thanks for the subscription, Jen. Always very nice to you to support the stream. But yeah, cool. And yeah, so I think that those end up being those end up being the things to revisit in this game. So overall in this game, I think that black had and thank you very much for participating, Jay, and thank you very much for explaining this. Yeah, so in this situation, the first thing to revisit, knight takes c6 is a move that I think is worth removing from your repertoire against Black Mardim Gambit. To be honest, of course, no, thank you very much for sending the game, and thank you for doing it. And I was just going to go through one by one on the things that I think are worth changing in this game. So knight to c6, if instead pawn takes f3, pawn takes f3 is the main line, knight to c6 is a move that's played less than 1% of the time and leads to an eval shift towards white. So I think that that's worth removing from your opening repertoire. Pawn takes f3 I think is just legitimately better. And yeah, knight takes d5, black is fine, and yeah, this situation is just is good for black. So you end up in a good situation. So white blundered too, but I think that knight to c6 is just objectively against best play by white. Knight to c6 is not very promising idea. Queen takes, e5, c6. Yeah, white black's up by a lot. And then from a positional perspective, I think that mangling the pawn structure and securing the d file for the rook is valuable. So don't get me wrong. I think that that's good, but I think that the cost of trading off the bishop pair, especially with this bishop facing on rook to g1, which was probably the most effective. This is probably the most effective square that white has for entering the black's position with a rook. So the fact that this bishop is facing off against this g1 makes it an even more valuable bishop. So this bishop is outposted, trading for a non-outposted knight. And yeah, the idea makes sense, and especially once you explained it, I think it's interesting. But I think that keeping the bishops on the board, and even keeping this bishop on the board, this bishop that's posted, I think that move in general, I think that this just wasn't the right idea for this time. Anyways, interesting situation, and yeah, thank you very much for explaining it, Jay. I appreciate it. Yeah, and then this, we saw that this basically runs into this rook takes d8 tactic. So between those three moves, the knight to c6 opening move, the trading off of the bishops as a positional idea, and then this final one, which runs into this tactic with rook to d8. I think those were the three components of the game that I think are the easiest targets for improvement. That's about one opening, one positional, and one tactical improvement. And yeah, I hope that's helpful. Thank you very much for sending the game, Jay. I really appreciate it. Thanks very much for being here. And yeah, it's always really helpful. Feel free to send as many more games as you'd like. And always happy to look things over. And I'm glad that you got something out of it. So yeah, thank you very much for that, Jay. I appreciate it. Cool. On to the next one. This game is from Joseph Florio. Okay, cool. Awesome. Cool. Yeah, thank you very much for joining the stream, Tebow. Appreciate it. And yeah, let's take a look. So this is Joseph Florio's game. Joseph Florio opens with e4, e6, d4, d5, knight to c3. And then we go into the French winnower variation. This is the French winnower. Okay, cool. And yeah, I guess what I would say here is e5. E5 ends up in a situation where white space, this is the main line move, right? E5 is played in 80-90% of games. E5, knight to c6, and then white has a few options. So, white's better by about a pawn and a quarter here. Knight to c6, interesting. Doesn't surprise me. Interesting. I don't even know what language that is, to be completely honest, but yeah, main line here, knight to c6 is a weird move. Knight to c6 is played 22 out of 25,000 games, so 1 in 1,000 games, end up in this situation for black. Black's main move, the move that I've seen here, is knight is c5. I guess knight to e7 is also playable. I haven't probably seen that, but don't really remember it super well. c5 is actually the move in the French winnower that that leads to a situation where white is basically this leads to the mainland French winnower. Knight to c6 though blocks in this key resource for black. So I think I would definitely say moving this knight in front of this pawn is an error. Better for black c6 or c5, and sort of needed for black or c6, c5. With this knight played to c6, this black's basically forfeiting a very key resource here. With that done, basically I think that this, I think white's in good place. Knight to e7, f4, knight f5, bishop f2. And yeah, white's up by a pawn or so. This ends up in a situation where white's, solid. Black, desperately needs to play c5 and doesn't. So, yeah, now white's just in a good French. g4, knight h6, g5, knight f5. And yeah, I think basically here white's going to have, it's going to be kind of a French position where white's attacking on the, by the way, this is a great French for white. I mean, basically, one of the metrics that's used to determine whether it's a good or bad French is the pawn structure, and basically how well white's able to maintain d4 and e5. And with d4 and e5, with this position, d4 and e5 are not going to get undermined for the rest of this game. So white basically can just start attacking on the king side here. I think that's his best route forward. And yeah, I think should be very comfortable, easy play for white, where he'll get a strong attack that will be very difficult for black to deal with. Cool, queen to g4, bishop c8, h6, bishop takes, and yeah, I think white's about 4 pawns up. But bad things happen to white. So let's watch. Basically, I think to this point, white's played kind of a great game in terms of improving. Not really much to add. Black played this very unusual knight to c6 move that blocked in a c pawn for the whole game. That was kind of weak. But yeah, now white's comfortably attacking and should be able to convert on this. But yeah, these were really errors. This advanced, so we got to figure out a better tactical play for white here because white's played a great game so far, and it's disappointing to see white basically trade off into a position where he can't make any further progress. So this was really the error. So something needed to improve here. I actually thought that the error was going to be earlier. I thought that basically trading off all these pawns and basically giving black a fixed pawn structure that white can't easily get into. I thought that this was the error, but I was not right about that. The engine's pointing towards the error as being... so basically here, queen to f6 is better. They're willing to just play this out into basically, really restricting the black king and then winning in the endgame for white. That's kind of an underwhelming way to win this, to be honest. But that's what that basically the engine is suggesting and makes intuitive sense. Basically, now you have a completely locked game. You also have the ability to play f5. You're going to have this f5 resource, which is going to end up trading off this f pawn on g6 for either the h pawn or the f pawn. So that's going to be an ongoing resource for white. But what's interesting about this is if white moves back, well, I don't think so. What's interesting is I think h6 is basically this h6 move I think was okay. Yeah, g6 would have opened things up. Yeah, so g6, I think g6, pawn takes, pawn takes, pawn takes. Yeah, probably a better continuation. h6, bishop takes, g6. Yeah, white's up by about 4 pawns here, and yeah. I mean, I don't know. Let's look at g6 immediately here. This also runs into some tactical complications. I'm actually sort of impressed by the computer's plan, though. So what would I have done here? What would I have done here is the first question. So yeah, so g6, what would I have done? I guess that I probably would have played something like bishop to d3. First, the engine is suggesting... okay, so black goes bishop to c8 here. I don't know. It would be great if you could get the f pawn in. I'm thinking bishop takes c8, queen takes c8, f5. That's probably what I would play. And then, now, you have this crazy 4-pawn attack going against the king. This is probably the most complete attack that you can assemble. I think that if the king goes to e2 and, like, rook to f1, I don't know. White, I can't imagine that white can't break open this king side here. Let's figure it out. Yeah, that pawn barrage looks really good. So I think something along the lines of like queen to f4, f6, maybe. I mean, you got to be a little bit careful because you really don't want to let the situation... You'd have to do this very carefully. Here, say black plays g6, which is given as the best move by the engine. Here, h takes, f takes, queen to h4, threatening h7. Black plays like h5, and then white plays f6. I don't know. That leaves things more intact than I actually would have liked here. How about like pawn takes g6? How does that look? At some point, you start actually giving black counterplay, which is actually a problem. So yeah, I guess that's my outcome. I would say queen f6 instead. Queen to f6, queen takes f6, g takes f6. This is the computerized line. This leads to an eval advantage of 2 plus pawns. And in this strategy, basically, white has everything locked up. He has the ability to play f5 and king to e2 paired with f5. Yeah, no, I think that's good, and I think basically this king to e2 f5, this will lead to a strong position for white. Maybe rook to b1 and then a4 or something for white. But yeah, white should be a fine here. No issues. Queen to g4, queen f3, queen to f5. Yeah, no issues here. I don't know, castles. But the issue is this is just very underwhelming. White had so much more that he could have gotten out of this, and yeah, just no real play for white really. Black advances on the center, and now you're in sort of an equalish game where basically you have different types of minor pieces, but no real opportunities for white. So I don't know. That seemed to play out badly. Let's just go through to the end. Now there's some crazy volatility with queen to f3. White hangs the queen. So just queen takes f3 was hanging. It's probably a blitz game. And then you end up in a draw. Okay, cool. So yeah, let's think about how white could have improved here. Knight to c6 was a weak move. Black should not have played that. Here, white's assembling, basically with the result of this kind of weak play by black, this weak knight to c6, white's going to start playing aggressively on the king side. Knight to f5, h4, h5, and white's got a lot of threats on the king side. So knight takes, bishop takes, bishop takes. Yeah, white's just got to continue this attack. So first, I don't really think this was a great idea. I think that h6, h6 simplifies into the situation. Bishop takes f5, queen takes f5. And then you have to choose between the supercomputer like queen to f6 or queen to h3. But both of these seem underwhelming given how effectively white had been attacking. So queen to f6 is the engine suggestion. Instead of h6, probably that line that we were looking at, bishop takes f8, bishop takes c8, queen to c8, f4, 5. I think this offers a much better overall attacking opportunity for white. This should work. This basically should work, and after pawn takes g6, f takes g6, yeah, I mean, this will eventually lead to white having a lasting kingside advantage. So yeah, that was better than h6. That line, bishop takes c8, f5, better than h6. So that was improvement number 1. And then improvement number 2, basically improvement number 2, queen to f6, pawn takes f6, and then with f5, put the rook on g1 and have f5 available as a resource for later. But yeah, thank you very much for sending the game, Joseph. Those are the improvements that I could come up with, and yeah, thank you for sending the game. Very interesting one. This very closed position out of this French winnower, and yeah, I think your best opportunity to improve this attack was with bishop takes c8 and f5. Then you would have 4 pawns going up against the black king side. Should be able to make that turn into some type of tactical win. So anyways, really interesting game. Thank you very much for sending it, Joseph. And on to our last one for tonight. Let's take a look. This is Old Maple's game. Thank you very much for sending this one, Old Maple. I appreciate it. All right, so we have Old Maple's game here. Old Maple is playing black, so we'll take it from their perspective, and he's playing the Benoni. Okay, cool. I haven't seen too much of the Benoni actually on this stream. I feel like that's one of those openings that we haven't seen as much as we could have. So that's interesting to me, at least in my opinion. But yeah, we'll take a look. Benoni theory. Let's actually look. I don't even know what the most popular lines against the Benoni are. Or as the Benoni are as black. Like I've never played this as black, so this is a good opportunity for me to learn a bit. E5, knight to f6. Yeah. E5, knight to f6, d6, g6. All opportunities. Uh, yeah, all opportunities for black. The four most common lines here. Jen is providing valuable insights to the stream. And yeah, this is interesting. I don't know this theory too well. Black opts for knight to f6. That's the second most popular. But yeah, I think this is interesting. Knight to f6, c4, b5. Okay, and now we're in this Benko gambit. So this is the Benoni defense, and then this is the Benko. Pawn takes b5. Benko gambit half accepted. Okay, cool. Didn't know that. a6. And then opportunities for white, the most commonly played, accepting this pawn on a6. That's number 1. b6 is number 2. e3 is number 3, and f3, and knight to c3. So there's a good number of options for white. White actually plays the 5th most common, but it looks like there's basically 5 acceptable lines. Let's learn the names, just because I don't know them. B takes, that's Benko gambit fully accepted. b6, this is half accepted pawn return variation. e3, this is the modern variation. Knight f3, this is the Dlugy variation. Okay, cool. And this is knight to c3, the Zaitsev system. Okay, interesting ideas. And yeah, let's look at knight to c3. This is the Zaitsev system. Most common for black here, a takes b5. Basically, a takes b5 is by far the most common choice. So Zaitsev system, a takes b5, e4. Okay, that's the most common line. I've seen this before. Should be fine for white. All right, cool. So this is so knight to c3, and then g6 is an offbeat move here, basically. G6 is played a lot less than the other moves. G6 leads to an eval change of over a pawn for white. So this is not a playable move for black. All right, good. I'm glad we got to this. So this is the Zaitsev system of the Benko. Hey, welcome, Prince Ariel. Thank you very much for joining the stream. So yeah, this G6 E4 combination, this leads to a big lead for white. So this is not a playable move. This is considered to be a mistake. And yeah, the main lines for black here, a takes b5 is by far the main line. Queen to a5 may also be playable. I'm not sure. Let's see if it's queen to a5 gets a book move designation. Still not as good as a takes b5. On a takes b5, you're basically in a situation where there's equality. But yeah, g6 over queen to a5 here for sure. G6 leads to a big difference after e4, which white actually plays. So e4, and then white's showing an eval advantage of about 1.6. That should be pretty good. I mean, that should be close to winning. Bishop to g7, another mistake. e5, knight to h5, and yeah, so we have some very clearly identifiable mistakes in this theory, which is actually really helpful, I think, Old Maple. I don't know this theory super well, and I think that this gives me an opportunity to learn it really well. So yeah, this is great. So with c4, b5, pawn takes b5, a6. There's 5 moves for white we saw. B takes a6. Fully accepted line, b6 pawn return line, e3 modern variation, f3 Dlugy variation, and knight to c3 Zaitsev system. Okay, cool. You play the Zaitsev system. That's, I guess, one of the 5 acceptable lines. g6 is an error. Now white's really winning. Cool. So yeah, so basically, the move here is pawn takes b5. I guess, I don't know, I'm not a Benko player, to be honest, but I think that having 5 clearly defined options for white in this is actually really helpful in terms of learning this theory. So let's take a look at each of the 5 lines. On b takes a6, you have 2 options. You either have g6 or bishop takes a6. Okay, that's good. That narrows that option in. Okay, on b6 you play d6, but you actually have a number of moves as black. You can either play d6, or queen takes b6, or e6. Those are the moves for black against this b6 line. Against the e3 line, Okay, against the e3 line, you again have a wide variety of choices, including g6, a takes b5, bishop to b7, or e6. E6, sorry. So this is another one where you're kind of free to do whatever. Up to you. But yeah, next, knight to c3, f3. F3, again, a takes b5 is the most common. A takes b5, e6, g6, d6. Pretty free. But knight takes c3, and you really only have one option. This is the, I think, so there's, so on the first option, you have two options. On the second one, you have a bunch. Third one, you have a bunch. Fourth one, you have a bunch. And then on the last one is really the only line where you really only have one line as black. A takes b5. So yeah, this is good to know. I mean, knight to c3, a takes b5. Very clearly defined improvement in your opening repertoire. I've got a feeling that this game is going to involve, basically improvements in opening repertoire. Bishop to g6, e5, and white's in great shape. This just never really was good for black. There's some tactical inaccuracies. I mean, this is sort of an interesting game. But white's going to have pretty dominant control of the center. Bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, and you're back to equality. I wasn't really expecting that to happen, but okay. Now you're there. Back to an equal position. And yeah, this is a weird Benoni pawn structure. I'm trying to think, because I don't know these lines extremely well. The Benoni pawn takes d5 here. I guess the main goal of this, right, is kind of evaluating what pawns you're trading off here. This d6 pawn performs a very key purpose in this position. It basically blocks your pawn on d5. So that's a real change, right? This pawn on d6 provides utility in defending this pawn on e5. So that's really a big that's something that is very clearly identifiable as valuable for black. This d6 pawn facing against this f4 pawn, if you trade both of those off, white's f4 pawn is not super useful. But black's d6 pawn is very useful in terms of preventing this advancing. So with that trade done, now this pawn can go to d6 and continue to advance there. So that's really what it is. Queen to c7, e6, and now we're getting into some crazy tactics. But and I don't know. I don't really want to spend too long on the tactics of this necessarily. This played on a lot longer than it needed to, actually. Yeah, so let's just take a look and let's come up with a really clear plan for what could have been improved. B5 Benko system. This is great. We got to do a great demonstration of the 5 different lines, 5 different acceptable lines. Zaitsev variation, fully accepted variation, pawn return variation, Delugi variation, and then the last one was so pawn takes, b6, f3, and e3. E3, what was this called? This was called this one was also called the Zaitsev, right? Or no, sorry. The E3 move was called the modern variation. Okay, so we learned 5 opening names. Really interesting idea. Basically this 5 opening names helpful. But yeah, here knight to c3 Zaitsev system. Okay, g6 is not the move. The move on knight to c3 is the only one of those 5 options where your option is pretty much required, where there's pretty much only a single move option here. They were also looking at queen to a5, but pawn takes b5 is clearly the main line. Pawn takes b5 is the move. G6 is not the move. And with g6, white gets e4 and then ultimately e5 played. Hey, thank you very much for the follow, Abraham. Thank you very much for joining the stream. But yeah, e4, bishop g7, e5, and now we're out of theory, and white has a huge edge. Okay, so cool. So we have a really clear way to improve this game going forward. On knight to c3, 5 knight to c3, pawn takes b5 is the move. The Benko is, I don't know the Benko super well. I know these lines a little bit, but A takes b5 is a clear best line. If you're playing the Benko, then you should at least. I feel like it's important to know that pawn takes b5 is the is the best move here for black. That's what I think, and basically the opening book agrees with that. Cool. So g6, e4, bishop g7, e5, and this knight's getting relocated to somewhere worse. And I think white erred here. I think white could just play g4. G4 just wins the knight here. That's big. So white could have won a piece. So knight to h5 was also an error. Knight to g8 instead, just better. But I wanted to leave all this kind of so first I think that this isn't super practical in the sense that hopefully after watching the stream you'll see that pawn takes b5 is the move and not g6, and then with that in mind you can basically you've improved your opening repertoire and you can sidestep all this. Second is this is something that happens in the Benoni, these e4 e5 pushes. They do happen in this opening. And knight to h5 is the wrong situation, wrong place to replace your knight. With g4, white gets a piece up, so that's probably already a win for white. So this is something that can happen in the Benoni, this early g4 against the knight on h5 that you definitely need to be aware of as the black player. So that I think is helpful, big picture. But in this game, so watch your knight on h5 basically is my point. But in this game, knight to g8 was fine, and white missed it anyways. But g4 would have been a killer for white there. Okay, so where are the improvements? White is better, and then equalizes. Basically. This looks like a pretty serious blunder. So queen to e3, and then rook takes f4. Oh, right, rook f takes f4. Oh, okay, so this is kind of funny. So rook takes f4, bishop to h6. Rook takes b4 is given as best. But, yeah, okay, interesting. So you basically equalize with rook there. And then, but now we're basically into this tactical part of the game, and I'm not super interested in that because I'm just going to read out computer output. But yeah, there's a great tactic here with rook takes f4, rook takes f4, bishop to h6, and then you win the full rook. I think, what happens on rook f1? Rook f1, queen takes d6. Yeah, wins for black. Okay, anyways, this situation was really interesting, and I guess what I'd want to say here is, your opportunities as black. This ended up being this basically ended up being a Benko with some misplays. So Benko is, I wouldn't say extremely, extremely theory heavy, but it's definitely got some theory that you should know. Pawn takes b5 is the correct move on knight to c3. We know this now. This is objectively best, mainline. Okay, cool. So that, if you learn nothing else from this analysis, then you know that knight to c3 against the Benko is responded to with pawn takes b5. I would also make sure that you come up with comfortable responses to the other 5 moves out of the Benko, which are f3 is the Delugi variation, d3 is the modern variation, fully accepted, and pawn return variation. And then this is the Zaitsev system. Okay, cool. I learned 5 names that I didn't know before. So yeah. So against each one of those 5 options, come up with a response that you're comfortable with and that going forward. If you're gonna play the Benko, you don't have to play the Benko, but if you're gonna play it, I strongly recommend coming up with a plan against each of those 5 things. Okay, g6. Now white's up a pawn and a half. And then this knight to h5 is another kind of thing that you can improve on. g4, takes the knight, basically wins the knight. So that's what I'm saying in this situation. This g4 facing off against h5, that is just worse for, this is just worse for black. Black loses a piece. So another thing to realize about the Benko, this d4 e4 combination, this happens in a lot of Benko games. I mean, not a lot. This happens in Banco games. So, you know, a big thing to pay attention to is your knight's ability to get trapped on h5. It could have happened in this game. It was lucky that it didn't. That is something that is a potential threat that you need to be aware of if you're playing Banco's system. And then after this, you know, there's some tactical volatility and stuff, but basically, you know, in a really big improving tactic was rook takes f4, rook takes f4, bishop to h6, and then you've got that pin on that rook. So that would have been a tactical improvement. But the big takeaways, I think, in terms of specifics here, you know, the move. So the first suggestion is really learn a response to each of the 5 options that White has out of the you know, basically out of the Banco system. You know, when a6 is played in the Banco, White has 5 responses. Come up with a good response to each of those 5 responses. I think that'll help you a lot. Okay, and then the next thing is really watch the knight on h5 in the Banco. Again, this didn't actually happen in the game, but that knight can get trapped over there, and that's definitely something that you need to be aware of kind of in the Banco system, you know, as a player of the Banco system going forward. So those are the two takeaway pieces of advice I think are helpful, and that's what I would get out of this game. Also, I got to learn the names of a bunch of different variations. I knew there were a bunch of variations on that particular point in the opening tree, but I didn't know their names, so now I know them. Cool. Awesome. I got a lot out of this. Awesome. All right. Next stream is at 8 a.m. Eastern tomorrow morning. I really look forward to seeing you there. And yeah, please join. Thank you all very much for being here. Thank you all very much for contributing your ideas to the stream and in signing your games. And yeah, have a good night, everyone. Next stream is in about 8 hours and 30 minutes, and I'm looking forward to seeing you there. Thanks very much for joining, everyone. Have a good night. Thanks. Bye.